Picture it. Munich, April 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. Cities burn. Europe is shattered. And inside Adolf Hitler's private apartment, a photographer prepares to take a bath. Not a metaphor, an actual bath. Mud from Dachau still clings to her boots, the same boots sitting defiantly on Hitler's pristine bath mat. A portrait of Hitler hangs nearby, and the woman stepping into that bathtub, she's not a soldier, not a politician, not a general. She is an artist, a model turned photographer, a surrealist, a war correspondent, a witness. And in one of the most haunting photographs of the 20th century, Lee Miller transforms survival into defiance. Because before she documented the collapse of fascism, Lee Miller had already spent her entire life refusing to stay inside the frame the world built for her. Welcome to Art Happens, the divine mess of art history, presented by J Squared Atelier. I'm James William Moore, your guide through the masterpieces, revolutions, scandals, and beautifully chaotic plot twists that make art history so fascinating. And today, we're shining the spotlight on Lee Miller, a woman who went from fashion model to surrealist photographer to one of World War II's most important visual witnesses. And honestly, if her life were pitched as a movie script, somebody would probably reject it for being too unbelievable. Lee Miller was born in Poughkeepsie, New York in 1907, and by the 1920s, she had become one of the faces of fashion photography. Legend says publishing giant Condé Nast himself helped discover her after preventing her from stepping into traffic in Manhattan, which sounds less like art history and more like the beginning of a very dramatic silent film. Soon, Lee Miller is everywhere. Vogue, advertisements, fashion spreads. Perfect lighting, perfect styling, perfect modern woman. But there's a problem. Lee Miller does not want to remain the subject of the photograph. She wants to make them. And that distinction matters because being looked at is not the same as being seen. And at the time, when women were often treated as decorative accessories within art and photography, Miller wanted authorship, control, experimentation. She wanted to move behind the camera, and that decision changes everything. In 1929, Lee Miller leaves New York and moves to Paris. And Paris at that moment is overflowing with artistic chaos. Writers, painters, photographers, surrealists. Everybody seems to be trying to reinvent reality itself. And eventually, Lee meets Man Ray. Now this is usually where art history lazily introduces her as Man Ray's muse. And sure, they were romantically involved. But reducing Lee Miller to somebody's inspiration completely misses the point, because she was also his collaborator, his assistant, a photographer with technical skill and artistic instincts of her own. In fact, one of the photographic techniques most associated with Man Ray, solarization, is widely connected to experimentation Lee helped develop in the darkroom. And honestly, art history has a bad habit of turning talented women into footnotes, orbiting great men with quotes. Lee Miller was not orbiting. She was building her own visual language. Her photographs became strange, elegant, and psychologically charged. A severed breast cast photographed like sculpture, distorted portraits, dreamlike compositions, fashion imagery that suddenly feels uncanny and unsettling. The Surrealists wanted to disrupt logic. Lee Miller understood that photography could destabilize reality just as effectively as painting could, and she did it with precision. But then the world changes. The 1930s darken. War approaches. And eventually, Surrealism collides headfirst with political catastrophe. For many artists, war becomes background noise. For Lee Miller, it becomes subject matter. She begins photographing London during the Blitz. Bomb shelters, rubble, civilians trying to continue daily life while the world detonates around them. And eventually, she becomes an accredited war correspondent for Vogue magazine. Now pause on that for a moment. Vogue, the fashion magazine, the same publication associated with elegance and luxury, is suddenly publishing images connected to the war through Miller's camera. And Lee Miller is right there, near the front lines, documenting history as it unfolds. Not sanitized history, not heroic propaganda, reality. Field hospitals, destroyed buildings, exhausted soldiers, women navigating survival during wartime. And what makes her photographs so powerful is that they never entirely lose their humanity. She does not photograph war like spectacle. She photographs people trapped inside it. The woman once photographed for beauty magazines is now photographing what humanity looks like after civilization begins tearing itself apart. And eventually, she reaches the camps. In 1945, Lee Miller and photographer David E. Sherman arrive at Dachau shortly after liberation. And there are moments in history where language itself begins to fail. This is one of them. The images from Dachau are horrific. Bodies, starvation, evidence of industrialized cruelty on a scale almost too overwhelming to comprehend. And Lee photographs it because somebody has to. Because denial thrives when nobody records the evidence. Because photography can become testimony. But imagine the psychological weight of witnessing that firsthand. Imagine carrying those images in your mind. And then, only hours later, Lee arrives in Munich, at Hitler's private apartment. The dictator who helped engineer all this destruction is dead. The regime is collapsing. And inside that apartment, Miller and Sherman create one of the most unforgettable photographs in art history. Lee Miller bathing in Hitler's tub. At first glance, the image almost feels absurd, surreal even. Like a performance piece before performance art fully becomes performance art. But the longer you look at it, the more complicated it becomes. Her muddy boots sit on the bath mat, and those boots matter because the mud came from Dachau. The camp follows her into the apartment, into the room, into the photograph. Nothing is clean. Nothing is separated. And meanwhile, Hitler's portrait hangs nearby, watching over the scene like some ghost of collapsed power. The photograph contains exhaustion, rage, dark humor, defiance, trauma, victory, all at once. And maybe that's why it continues haunting people, because it captures a moment where history itself feels emotionally impossible to process. A woman the Nazi regime would have considered disposable is now occupying the private space of fascist power. Not with violence, with presence, with witness, with the camera nearby. And the image refuses simplicity. It is not triumphant in some clean Hollywood way. It feels tired, heavy, complicated, human, which is probably why it still feels modern. But surviving history and documenting history are not the same thing as escaping history. And after the war, Lee struggles deeply. Today, we would likely recognize much of it as PTSD, depression, alcoholism, emotional withdrawal, the psychological cost of seeing too much. And this part matters because there is often a temptation to romanticize artists who suffer, to turn trauma into mythology. But Lee's pain was real. The camera preserved history, but it could not protect the person holding it. Eventually, she retreats from much of the art world and photography. And for years, large portions of her story fade from broader public attention, which feels tragically fitting for somebody so often underestimated during her lifetime. Lee Miller's life refuses easy categories: model, photographer, muse, surrealist, war correspondent, witness. And maybe the reason her work still resonates is because it forces us to confront contradiction, beauty alongside horror, performance alongside truth, art alongside evidence. She spent her life stepping outside frames other people tried to build for her, and in doing so, she became one of 20th century's most important photographers, not because she captured history from a safe distance. No, but because she walked directly into it. And sometimes, she carried the mud home with her. Thanks for joining me for this Artist Spotlight episode of Art Happens, the Divine Mess of Art History, presented by J² Atelier. I'm James William Moore, and remember, art doesn't just document history. Sometimes it stares history directly in the face and refuses to look away.